Imagine this. A thunderous roar echoes down the drag strip as a 1964 Plymouth or Dodge explodes off the line, tires smoking, front end lifting skyward in a display of raw, untamed power. Then the scene cuts sharply to an old NHRA rulebook, yellowed pages marked with bold red ink, lines crossed out, numbers adjusted, as if the very rules of the sport were being forcibly rewritten to catch up. What if an engine was so dominant that the rulebook had to be rewritten just to slow it down? This isn't the story of an engine that was ever banned or outlawed. It's the true, documented account of one whose overwhelming natural advantage forced the NHRA to make repeated adjustments, shifting classes, adding weight penalties, and restructuring competition, quietly changing the balance of drag racing history. We're relying solely on real race results from 1964, official NHRA decisions, and the engineering that made it all possible. Here are some powerful visuals of that era-defining launch and the beast behind it. And to understand why nothing could touch it, look inside the heart of the machine, the massive hemispherical combustion chambers that gave it unmatched airflow and power. His is the 426 Chrysler Hemi, introduced in 1964. Its dominance was immediate and overwhelming. At that year's NHRA US Nationals, it powered an all-Hemi final round in stock eliminator, sweeping the field like no engine had before. The engine was never declared illegal. It was simply too good. So the rules changed around it. Stick around, we're diving into the real history next. In the 1960s, drag racing was more than just a weekend sport. It was a full-on technological arms race. Engine power increased dramatically from one season to the next, often moving faster than the rulebook could keep up. The NHRA, as the official sanctioning body, had a clear and consistent mission: maintain fair competition, prioritize safety, and ensure the long-term survival and growth of drag racing as a whole. To achieve that, they focused on protecting three essential elements. First, parity, so no single manufacturer, engine, or combination could dominate every event and drive away the rest of the competitors. Second, affordability, preventing costs from spiraling so high that only factory-backed teams could afford to race. And third, variety, making sure fans continued to see Chevrolets, Fords, Pontiacs, Dodges, Plymouths, and others all fighting for wins, rather than one brand owning the winner's circle weekend after weekend. The NHRA wasn't trying to target Chrysler or single out the 426 Hemi specifically. They responded to dominance in whatever form it took, whether it was Chevrolet's later big block wrap motor, Ford's Boss 429, or even the early nitro-burning funny car experiments. Whenever any combination began winning too consistently and too overwhelmingly, the rules were adjusted to restore balance. This is the larger context for what happened next. When the 426 Hemi arrived in 1964, it didn't violate any existing rules. It simply redefined what fast meant on the drag strip, and that forced the NHRA to respond by rewriting parts of the rulebook around it. Next, we meet the engine that changed everything. To truly understand why the NHRA had to keep rewriting rules around this one power plant, we have to go back to the moment it first appeared, and why it felt like nothing else on Earth could touch it. The story begins in late 1963, when Chrysler Corporation quietly decided they were no longer content to play second fiddle in the emerging muscle car wars. Ford had its lightweight Galaxy 500s and Thunderbolts, Chevrolet was rolling out 409s and then the 427 mystery motor, Pontiac had the Super Duty 421s, and everyone was chasing the next big horsepower number. Chrysler's engineers, led by Tom Hoover and a small, obsessive team in Highland Park, Michigan, knew they needed something revolutionary, not just another wedgehead big block with a few more cubic inches. They needed an engine that could breathe at extremely high RPM, make massive torque down low, and survive the brutal, repeated abuse of quarter-mile runs at full throttle. Enter the 426 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi. Officially unveiled to the public in 1964 as the Race Hemi, to distinguish it from the earlier 1950s firepower Hemi that had been discontinued, this was no street motor dressed up for the track. It was built from the ground up as a purpose-built racing engine that just happened to be offered in a limited number of street-legal production cars to satisfy NHRA homologation rules. The key to its dominance lay in three massive engineering advantages that, when combined, created a power curve no other American V8 could match at the time. First, the hemispherical combustion chamber itself. Instead of the flat or shallow, wedged chambers used by nearly every competitor, the Hemi featured true half-sphere, hemispherical heads. This shape allowed for much larger valves, intake and exhaust valves that were both enormous and positioned almost directly opposite each other. Larger valves mean better breathing, especially at high RPM. More air and fuel in, more exhaust out, more power, period. Second, the valve angle and port design. Because the valves were canted outward at a wide angle, the intake and exhaust ports could be made extremely straight and large. There was almost no restriction to airflow. Where a typical wedgehead big block might start to choke above 6,000 revolutions per minute, the 426 Hemi could happily rev to 7,200, 7,500, even higher in race trim, pulling hard the whole way. That gave it not just peak horsepower, but a monstrously wide power band, perfect for the drag strip, where you need to launch hard and carry momentum through the entire 1,320 feet. Third, brute construction. This wasn't a lightweight, fragile exotic. The block was cast iron, thick-walled and overbuilt. The crankshaft was forged steel, the connecting rods were massive, and the heads were aluminum in early race versions, though production street Hemis used iron heads. Chrysler engineers knew this thing would be asked to make 500-plus horsepower on pump gas in superstock trim and far more in nitro-burning top fuel applications. It had to be bulletproof, and it was. When the first customer race Hemis hit the track in early 1964, the results were immediate and shocking. At the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona that February, Hemi-powered cars began sweeping their classes. By summer, the domination was undeniable. At the 1964 Nationals in Indianapolis, the biggest event of the year, the stock eliminator final was an all-Hemi affair, 2 Mopar teams, both running 426 Hemis, duking it out for the title. That wasn't a fluke, it was a preview. Ron, the Snake, Sox, Bill, Grumpy, Jenkins, Don, the Beachcomber, Nicholson, the Ramchargers, the Golden Commandos, Sox and Martin. The list of early Hemi heroes reads like a who's who of 1960s drag racing royalty. In superstock, Hemi cars were running low 11s and high 10s on street tires and pump gas, while competitors were still struggling to break into the 12s with comparable cubic inches. In the factory experimental F/X classes, where rules were looser and cars could be lighter, Hemi A/FX cars were dipping into the low 10s and even high 9s, numbers that were supposed to belong to fuel dragsters, not production-based stockers. The engine didn't just win races. It redefined what was possible. It exposed the limitations of every other factory engine on the market. Chevrolet's 409 was strong but couldn't breathe like the Hemi. Ford's 427 was fast but required far more cubic inches to make similar power. Pontiac's 421 Super Duty was a torque monster but lacked the top end. The 426 Hemi combined low-end grunt, mid-range snap, and high RPM pull in a way that felt almost unfair. And that was exactly the problem. NHRA officials began to notice the pattern. More and more Mopar entries, fewer and fewer Chevys and Fords making deep runs, and starting lines that were increasingly painted red and white, Chrysler corporate colors. The crowds loved the sound and the speed, but the field was losing diversity. Teams without access to a Hemi, or without the budget to buy, build, and maintain one, were getting left behind. The cost of staying competitive was skyrocketing because the bar had been raised so high, so fast. The engine itself was completely legal. Every Hemi that ran in NHRA competition met the homologation requirements. A minimum number of street-legal production cars had been built. The famous 1964 to 1965 Plymouth Belvedere and Dodge Coronet Hemi packages, and they ran in the classes they were supposed to run in. No cheating, no hidden modifications beyond what the rules allowed. It was simply too good, too dominant, too fast, too consistent. And so, quietly at first, then more forcefully, the NHRA began to respond, not by banning the engine, they never did, but by changing the environment in which it had to compete. Weight breaks were adjusted. Class minimums were rewritten. Lightweight components that had helped the Hemi cars shine were restricted or outlawed. Later, in pro stock, the Hemi would be saddled with higher pounds per horsepower minimums than wedge motors from other manufacturers. The same engine in the same cars suddenly had to carry more weight, run against lighter competitors, or give up class advantages it had previously enjoyed. This is the heart of the story. The 426 Chrysler Hemi was never erased from the rulebook. It was never deemed illegal. It was never outlawed. The rules were reshaped around it, again and again, until its once overwhelming advantage was reduced to something more manageable, something that could coexist with the rest of the field. That process of reshaping created the legend of the engine that was erased. Fans who watched it dominate in 1964 to 1965 saw it slowly fade from the top step of the podium. They saw the same iron, same heads, same block, same displacement, suddenly unable to run away with races the way it once did. And that's what we're going to unpack next. The specific rule changes, year by year, that turned the most dominant engine of its era into just another competitor. The Hemi didn't lose its power. The rules took away its room to run. And drag racing was never the same again. When winning became the problem, the 426 Hemi didn't arrive with a target on its back. It simply did what it was designed to do, better, faster, and more consistently than anything else on the quarter mile. In 1964 and into 1965, the results spoke for themselves. Hemi-powered cars began stacking wins at a rate that turned heads. Regional events turned into Mopar showcases. National events started to feel predictable. The Ramchargers, the Sox and Martin team, the Golden Commandos, the Al Burglar crew, and countless privateers running factory Hemi packages were all posting times that left competitors scrambling to figure out how to catch up. In Superstock, a well-tuned 426 Hemi Plymouth or Dodge could run consistent 11.30s to 11.50s on street-legal tires and pump gas, numbers that were supposed to be reserved for heavily modified factory experimental cars. In the more liberal F/X classes, where weight reductions and fiberglass parts were allowed, those same engines were dipping into the tens. For context, that was dragster territory in many cases. Stock-bodied cars shouldn't have been able to do that. But the Hemi didn't care about shouldn't. The NHRA started seeing the same pattern every weekend. Starting lines that used to feature a healthy mix of brands, Chevy 2 Novas with 327s, Ford Fairlanes with 427s, Pontiac GTOs, Oldsmobile 442s, began to tilt heavily toward red, white, and blue Mopars. Eliminations rounds increasingly turned into Mopar versus Mopar battles. Non-Hemi teams, especially privateers without factory support, found themselves unable to make deep runs unless they could afford to buy or trade for a Hemi. The cost to remain competitive skyrocketed. Teams that once ran a reliable 409 or 421 now needed a full-race Hemi, the right transmission, the right rear, the right tires, and the budget to keep it all in one piece after every pass. This wasn't about cheating or rule-breaking. Every Hemi car that dominated those early years was legal under the existing stock or factory experimental classes. They met the minimum production numbers. They ran the required weights. They used approved tires and fuel. The NHRA rulebook at the time simply hadn't anticipated an engine that could produce that much usable power across such a wide RPM range while remaining durable enough to survive a full season of national events. Winning became the problem because the sport is built on competition. When one combination starts winning 70 to 80% of the national events in its class, the field shrinks. Teams drop out. Manufacturers lose interest if their products can't compete. Fans notice when the same 3 or 4 teams keep meeting in the final round. The excitement of watching different brands battle it out fades when the outcome starts feeling inevitable. NHRA officials didn't need a formal complaint to see what was happening. They saw the entry lists. They saw the final rounds. They saw the same cars and the same engines dominating weekend after weekend. And they understood the long-term risk. If the sport became a one-make or one-engine show, it would lose its diversity, its accessibility, and eventually its fan base. The Hemi wasn't just winning races. It was changing the entire competitive landscape. It was making other engines obsolete overnight. It was pricing teams out of the sport unless they could match its performance. It was turning drag racing into a Mopar parade at the biggest events. And that's when winning stops being just winning. That's when it becomes a threat to the balance that keeps the sport alive. The 426 Hemi was never illegal. It never needed to be outlawed. It was simply so effective, so superior under the existing rules, that the NHRA had no choice but to act. Not to punish Chrysler. Not to erase an engine from history. But to restore parity. To keep the starting lines diverse. To keep the costs from spiraling out of control. To make sure drag racing remained a sport where multiple manufacturers and multiple engine designs could realistically fight for the win. So they began the process of reshaping the rules around the Hemi. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly over years, in ways both subtle and overt. The engine stayed the same. The cars stayed the same. The drivers stayed the same. But the playing field, that changed. And that's exactly what we're going to examine next. The specific rule changes, year by year, that turned the most dominant engine of the 1960s into something that had to fight for every tenth of a second, just like everyone else. The NHRA didn't declare war on the 426 Hemi with a single dramatic ban. Instead, they did what sanctioning bodies do when one combination threatens the balance of the sport. They adjusted, tweaked, and rebalanced, piece by piece, year after year, until the overwhelming advantage was brought back under control. The process began almost immediately after the 1964 season ended, and it never really stopped. 1965, the first major pushback. Right out of the gate, NHRA targeted the lightweight components that had helped Hemi cars shine in factory experimental A/FX classes. Chrysler had been aggressive with aluminum front clips, fiberglass hoods, lightweight bumpers, and other weight-saving tricks on their A/FX cars, legal at the time, but giving them a massive edge. In early 1965, the NHRA banned most exotic, lightweight materials in factory experimental. Aluminum panels were restricted or outlawed outright for certain applications. Cars had to retain more factory steel. The result, Hemi A/FX cars suddenly weighed hundreds of pounds more than they had the previous season. At the same time, NHRA began shuffling the Hemi cars between classes, sometimes forcing them out of the lighter superstock classes into heavier factory experimental, then back again. This constant reclassification made it extremely difficult for teams to optimize setups. One weekend a car might be legal in SS/, the next it was bumped into A/FX with stricter rules. The goal was clear: take away the free weight reduction that had let the Hemi run away from the field. Late 1960s, the weight break wars. By 1968 to 1969, the Hemi was still very strong in superstock, but the NHRA introduced a new weapon, the pounds per horsepower, lbs/HP, minimum weight formula. This rule set a sliding scale. Cars with more horsepower had to weigh more. The NHRA assigned different factors to different engines based on observed performance. Wedge motors, like Chevy 396/427, Ford 428, Pontiac 400/455, often received more favorable, lighter, weight breaks. The 426 Hemi, because of its proven dominance, consistently got the harshest factor, meaning Hemi cars had to carry significantly more pounds per horsepower than comparable engines from other manufacturers. In some cases, a Hemi car might have to weigh 100 to 150 pounds more than a similar Chevy or Ford to run in the same class. That extra ballast on the nose or in the trunk killed launch, hurt 60-foot times, and made the car harder to hook up. The same engine, same cylinder heads, same displacement, now handicapped by hundreds of extra pounds. 1970 to 1972, Pro Stock arrival and continued handicapping. When Pro Stock was created in 1970 as a showcase class for near-stock appearing cars, the NHRA again used the weight break system to keep the Hemi from running away. Early Pro Stock Hemis were fast. Ronnie Sox was posting 9-second runs almost immediately, but they were never allowed to run at the same weight as wedge-powered cars. The Hemi factor remained the toughest, forcing Mopar teams to carry extra weight while Chevrolets, Fords, and AMC engines got lighter minimums. By 1972, the disparity was so pronounced that some Mopar teams began switching to small block combinations or even Chevrolet engines just to get a better weight break. The irony was stark. Teams that built the most powerful, most legendary engine in drag racing history were sometimes forced to abandon it to stay competitive. The core principle behind every change. Across all these adjustments, material bans, class reassignments, weight penalties, factor adjustments, the engine itself remained untouched. No displacement limit was placed on the 426. No valve size restrictions were imposed. No material requirements were changed for the block or heads. The 426 Hemi stayed exactly the same. Same hemispherical chambers, same massive valves, same airflow, same power potential. The rules changed around it. The environment changed. The playing field tilted. And the results were immediate and measurable. Hemi cars that once ran away with national events now fought tooth and nail for round wins. Starting lines became diverse again, more Chevys, more Fords, more Pontiacs, more variety. The cost curve flattened because teams didn't have to chase an unbeatable combination anymore. The sport stabilized. This wasn't about punishing Chrysler. This wasn't about erasing an engine from history. This was the NHRA doing exactly what it was created to do: protect competitive balance so the sport could survive and grow. The 426 Hemi remained a legal, powerful, iconic engine throughout every one of these changes. It just had to carry more weight, run in tougher classes, and fight harder for every victory. The legend of the erased engine was born from that simple truth. The most dominant power plant of its era didn't fade because it got worse. It faded because the rules made sure nothing could stay that dominant forever. Next, we'll explore why fans still talk about it as erased, and what really happened to the Hemi's place in the winner's circle over time. The phrase, the engine NHRA erased, isn't something you'll find in any official rulebook or NHRA press release. It never appears in meeting minutes, never shows up in the annual rule changes announcement. The engine was never banned, never outlawed, never declared obsolete or illegal. Yet for decades, among die-hard Mopar fans, vintage drag racers, and anyone who watched the sport in the mid to late 1960s, the story persists. The 426 Hemi was quietly, methodically erased. So where does that perception come from? It comes from what people actually saw on the track. In 1964 and most of 1965, the Hemi was a force of nature. You could count on one hand the number of national event final rounds that didn't feature at least one 426 powered car. Hemi Cudas, Hemi Belvederes, Hemi Coronets, Hemi Chargers, they were everywhere in the winner's circle. The sound alone, the deep, guttural, unmistakable Hemi idle turning into a howling scream at launch, became the signature soundtrack of drag racing's golden age. Then, slowly at first, the picture began to change. After the 1965 material bans and class reshuffling, you started seeing fewer all-Hemi finals. By the late 1960s, with the weight penalties in full effect, the Hemi cars were still fast, still capable of winning, but they weren't running away anymore. They had to work for it. They had to carry extra ballast, fight for traction, and nail every shift just to stay even with lighter, better balanced wedge-powered competitors. By the time Pro Stock debuted in 1970, the pattern was undeniable. The class was supposed to showcase factory hot rods, and it did, but the Hemi, once the undisputed king, was now just one of several contenders. Chevrolet big blocks, Ford Boss motors, even AMC engines began showing up in winners' circles more frequently. The Mopar teams were still there, still competitive, still legendary. Ronnie Sox won the first Pro Stock championship in a Hemi Cuda, but the dominance was gone. Fans who had watched the Hemi sweep entire seasons suddenly saw starting lines filled with more variety. The red and white Mopars were still present, still loud, still powerful, but they weren't the only story anymore. The same engine that once made races feel almost unfair now had to fight tooth and nail for every round win. To the people in the stands, especially those loyal to Chrysler products, it felt like something had been taken away. Not the engine itself, the block, heads, and displacement were still sitting under the hood exactly as they had been in 1964. What was taken away was the effortless superiority, the free reign, the inevitability. The NHRA had succeeded in its mission. They restored parity. They brought back diversity. They kept the sport from becoming a one-make parade. But in doing so, they also took away the spectacle of watching one engine rewrite the record books every weekend. That loss is what created the legend. The Hemi didn't disappear. It didn't get weaker. It didn't lose its magic. The rules simply made sure nothing could stay that dominant forever. And when the Hemi's once overwhelming edge was reduced to a more level playing field, many fans felt like the greatest engine of the era had been quietly retired from its throne, even though the engine itself kept racing, kept winning, kept evolving for decades afterward. That's why the word erased still echoes. Not because the NHRA tried to wipe the 426 Hemi from history, but because they succeeded in making it just another great engine, instead of the one great engine that stood above all others. And that shift, from untouchable to merely excellent, is what many longtime fans still mourn. Next, we'll look at the long-term impact, how the NHRA's response to the Hemi shaped the entire future of drag racing rulemaking, and why no engine has been allowed to dominate unchecked ever since. The 426 Hemi didn't just dominate a couple of seasons and fade away. Its brief but overwhelming reign left a permanent mark on how the NHRA, and drag racing as a whole, would approach competition for the next 60 years. The most obvious and enduring legacy is the modern philosophy of parity through handicapping. Before the Hemi, rule changes in drag racing were mostly reactive and occasional, mostly about safety, like requiring roll cages or fire suppression, or closing obvious loopholes. After the Hemi era, the NHRA institutionalized a proactive, data-driven system of performance balancing. They began using weight breaks, factor adjustments, class minimums, and even engine combination restrictions as standard tools, not just emergency fixes. No single engine or manufacturer has ever been allowed to dominate unchecked again. When Chevrolet introduced the big block wrap motor in the late 1960s, it quickly became strong enough to threaten parity. The NHRA applied weight penalties to keep it in check. When Ford's Boss 429 and Boss 302 arrived, same thing. Favorable weight brakes were quickly adjusted. When Pro Stock small blocks and big blocks started outrunning each other unevenly in the 1980s and 1990s, the class evolved into a tightly controlled index system with minimum weights, maximum displacements, and strict engine rules that made sure no one combination ran away. Today, in top fuel and funny car, every car uses a supercharged, nitromethane-burning version of the same basic Hemi architecture, yet the rules are so precise, blower size, fuel flow, clutch settings, wing angle, etc., that the field stays within hundredths of a second. The Hemi became the benchmark. It was the first engine so dominant that the NHRA had to invent new ways to control it. And every major rule evolution since has been built on the lessons learned in those 1965 to 1972 years. Act early, act often, use data, and never let one combination become untouchable. Another lasting impact is cultural and emotional. The erased Hemi story became a cautionary tale among racers, teams, and fans. It taught manufacturers that building something truly revolutionary could backfire, not because the engine would be banned, but because the rules would be reshaped around it so aggressively that the advantage would evaporate. Some teams even began to self-regulate, designing engines that were good enough to win, but not so good that they'd trigger a massive rule crackdown. Ironically, the very engine that was handicapped the hardest became the foundation for the fastest classes in the sport. Every modern NHRA top fuel dragster and funny car runs a blown, nitro-injected 500 cubic inch Hemi derivative. The hemispherical chamber design, the massive valves, the airflow efficiency, these are the same principles Chrysler engineers perfected in 1964. The NHRA didn't erase the Hemi. They contained it, then later embraced it as the DNA of the sport's quickest machines. The long-term result? Drag racing survived the muscle car era's technological arms race. It didn't become a one-make or one-engine series. It kept its diversity, its accessibility for privateers, at least in some classes, and its appeal to multiple manufacturers. And it gave us one of the most enduring icons in motorsport, the 426 Hemi, forever remembered as the engine so good that the rulebook had to change to keep up. That's not erasure. That's immortality through adaptation. Next, we'll take a balanced look at the big question that still divides fans. Was it unfair? Did the NHRA go too far, or did they do exactly what was needed to save the sport? This is the question that still sparks heated debates at car shows, in online forums, and among longtime drag racing fans. Did the NHRA go too far? Was the 426 Hemi unfairly targeted, handicapped, and ultimately erased from its rightful place as the king of the sport? Or did the sanctioning body do exactly what it was supposed to do, protect the long-term health of drag racing? Let's look at both sides fairly, because there's truth on each. The Mopar/Hemi fan perspective, it was unfair. For the teams, drivers, and fans who lived through the Hemi's golden years, the rule changes felt like punishment for excellence. Chrysler spent years of engineering effort and millions of dollars, in 1960s money, developing an engine that was legitimately better breathing, better power delivery, better durability. They built street-legal cars to meet the rules, raced them cleanly, and won because they earned it. Then, almost as soon as the wins started piling up, the NHRA began moving the goalposts, banning lightweight parts, reclassifying cars, slapping on weight penalties, assigning the harshest factors. The same engine that swept the 1964 Nationals suddenly had to haul extra ballast while competitors ran lighter. The same heads, same valves, same displacement, now fighting with one hand tied. To many, it looked like the NHRA said, "You're too good. We're going to make sure you can't stay that good." It took away the pure, raw thrill of watching mechanical superiority play out without compromise. It felt like the sport rewarded mediocrity over excellence, punishing the team that innovated the hardest. And for the loyal Chrysler faithful, it felt personal, like the NHRA was protecting other manufacturers at Mopar's expense. The NHRA/parity perspective, it was necessary. On the other side, the sanctioning body's defenders argue that drag racing would not have survived the way it did without those adjustments. If the Hemi had been allowed to keep dominating at the 1964 to 1965 level, the starting lines would have become increasingly one-sided. More teams would have quit or switched to Mopars just to stay relevant. Privateers without factory support would have been priced out completely. Other manufacturers, Chevrolet, Ford, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, might have pulled back factory involvement if their engines couldn't realistically compete. The sport would have lost its diversity, its accessibility, and eventually its fan base. A one-make or one-engine series is not drag racing as we know it. Drag racing thrives on the rivalry, Bowtie versus Blue Oval versus Mopar versus AMC. When that rivalry disappears, the spectacle fades. The NHRA's job isn't to crown the single best engine. Their job is to create conditions where the best drivers, tuners, and teams can win, no matter what's under the hood. By handicapping the Hemi, they preserved that possibility. They kept multiple brands in the hunt. They kept costs from spiraling into the stratosphere. They kept the sport alive for the next generation. The honest conclusion: neither side is completely wrong. The Hemi was treated more harshly than other engines of the era, because it deserved to be. It was that much better. The rule changes weren't fair in the sense of equal treatment for all engines. They were fair in the sense of equal opportunity for all competitors. This wasn't about punishing Chrysler or hating on the Hemi. It was about control. Control of the sport's future, control of its diversity, control of its accessibility. The NHRA chose to sacrifice a little bit of raw, unchecked mechanical dominance in exchange for a broader, more sustainable competitive landscape. And looking back from today, it's hard to argue they made the wrong call. Drag racing is still here. Multiple manufacturers still compete. Private teams can still win national events. And the 426 Hemi itself? It's still revered, still raced in nostalgia classes, still the foundation of the nitro-burning monsters that run 3-second quarter miles. The rules reshaped its dominance. They didn't destroy its legacy. Next, we close with what remains, the legacy that no rule change could ever erase. In the end, the NHRA could change the rules, shift the weight breaks, rewrite the classes, and level the playing field, but they could never erase the legend of the 426 Chrysler Hemi. Today, more than 60 years after its debut, the 426 Hemi remains one of the most instantly recognizable names in all of motorsport. Walk into any major car museum, from the Henry Ford Museum to the Peterson Automotive Museum to the Chrysler Museum of Art, and you'll find a 426 Hemi engine on prominent display, often with a cutaway showing those massive hemispherical chambers and the engineering that once shook the drag strip world. Restorations of original 1964 to 1971 Hemi cars are among the most valuable and sought-after muscle cars on the planet. A well-documented, numbers-matching 1968 Hemi Charger or 1970 Hemi Cuda can command seven-figure prices at auction. Collectors don't pay that for a car. They pay for the story of an engine so powerful it forced the rulebook to bend. In nostalgia drag racing, the Hemi is alive and roaring louder than ever. The NHRA's Nostalgia Super Stock class regularly features restored 1960s Hemi Mopars running heads-up, just like the old days, many still posting times that would have been competitive in the late 1960s. The Mopar Hemi Challenge at the NHRA US Nationals has become one of the most anticipated events of the year, drawing huge crowds who come to hear that unmistakable sound and watch history come back to life. And perhaps the greatest irony of all, the engine the NHRA worked so hard to contain in the 1960s and 1970s became the architectural foundation for the sport's fastest machines. Every modern NHRA top fuel dragster and funny car, cars that routinely run the quarter mile in under 4 seconds at over 330 miles per hour, uses a supercharged, nitromethane-burning derivative of the 426 Hemi design. The same hemispherical heads, the same valve angles, the same airflow philosophy that made the original Hemi untouchable in 1964 are still at the heart of the quickest accelerating vehicles on Earth. Rules can reshape racing. They can add weight, change classes, and force balance. They can take away dominance and restore parity. But they cannot erase greatness. The 426 Chrysler Hemi wasn't just an engine. It was a moment in time when engineering pushed the boundaries so far that the sport itself had to evolve to keep up. It proved that one power plant could be so superior that it changed the rules forever. And in doing so, it became immortal, not despite the changes, but because of them. So the next time you hear that deep Hemi idle, or see that familiar red and white Mopar launch hard down the strip, remember, this is the engine that was so good, the rulebook had to be rewritten to slow it down. And even after all these years, nothing has ever truly slowed down the legend. Thanks for watching. The 426 Hemi may have been contained, but it was never, and will never be, erased.